Shalom vänner! Profetisk uppdatering 13 april 2024. Idag har jag Turkiet i fokus en del här. 2 videor. Och den första videon berättar om att Turkiet, citat, upprätthåller ett massivt embargo mot varor som exporteras till Israel. Det är ingen smart idé när hela ekonomin i Turkiet är på gränsen till kollaps. Inflationen är helt galen. Kortsiktig och dålig politik, ja, men inte enbart det. Vi vet ju vad som är sagt därifrån. Från Erdogan. Och den som förbannar Israel blir förbannad av Gud. Vi läser i första Mosebok 12 och vers 3. Jag ska välsigna dem som välsignar dig och förbanna den som förbannar dig. I dig skall alla släkter på jorden bli välsignade. Ja, först den totala uppfyllelsen är Jesus Kristus Messias. Men det gäller också det folket där han föddes och levde. Jesus, det judiska folket, och det gäller Abrahams ättlingar genom Isak och Jakob, de 12 stammarna och så vidare. Ordet välsigna, barak på hebreiska, har med ödmjukhet att göra som vi vet. Det innehåller ju betydelsen att knäböja. Det vill säga vi knäböjer inför Gud och inför hans planer. Och vi välsignar Guds plan med Israel. Vi gör inte som Erdogan och många andra. Vi förbannar inte Israel. Att förbanna kalal betyder att göra lätt. Att se någon som värdelös och förakta. Honom ska Gud förbanna. Hebreiska arar, som betyder att avsky. Att mota bort. Och det är inte smart att bli förbannad av Gud. Det gäller alla som hatar judarna och Israel och även som hatar kristna. Det är inte alls smart. Den andra videon är från TBN och handlar om en judisk man som var född i den romerska staden Tarsus, en stad i Turkiet idag. Han växte sedan upp i Jerusalem och vi känner honom som aposteln Paulus. Här får vi höra varför Paulus skrev romarbrevet och vi får höra om Guds hjärta för Israel genom Paulus. Vi blir påminna om att det är tack vare den judiske Messias, Jesus eller Jeshua, som vi har fått del i Israels välsignelse. Hedningar och judar är ett genom korset, tack vare Jesu Kristi kors, det han gjorde där, försoningen för oss. När han bar våra synder i sin kropp, som det står. Men han dog och uppstod och han har gjort oss till ett i tron på honom. Vi får till sist se en intervju med en pastor i Christ Church i Gamla stan i Jerusalem. En församling med både judar och araber och andra folkslag som vill bevara andens enhet i en för övrigt splittrad stad idag, Jerusalem. Och det är, tycker jag, intressanta videor det här som vi får ta del av. Och med det önskar jag er Guds välsignelse och shalom.
So Turkey just announced they're enforcing a massive embargo on goods being exported to Israel. Now, on the face of it, it may sound like a bad idea for little Israel and a really, really fun idea for Turkey, but unfortunately, that's not the case. And in this video, I'll explain to you why it's not a good idea to do that when your entire economy is on the brink of collapse. And make no mistake, Turkey is in a world of problems. You see, President Erdogan or Prime Minister Erdogan or Godfather Erdogan, I don't know, he's been that for the past 250 years, it seems. Ever since he got re-elected, surprise, in 2023, inflation jumped from 40% to 80%. And in this whole time frame, he actually increased rates 9 times, and it still didn't work. Right now, the Turkish lira is down 500% of the past 5 years. And basically, the Turkish economy isn't budging, isn't moving. The Turkish Fed is raising rates like crazy, but it isn't doing anything. inflation is just spiking out of control. So what's going on in Turkey? And the short answer is that President Erdogan, or Godfather Erdogan, decided to mortgage the entire economic future of Turkey for the next 30 years for about 10 years of short-term greatness. He loosened up everything, QE, quantitative easing, bombarded the economy with lots of money, lots of wealth, no interest, and he created a major euphoric decade for Turkey in which everything was great. But when you spend a lot on credit cards, eventually that bill comes in, and now it's here, and it's a hefty one. When he was the prime minister in 2002, about 20 years ago, he kept rates low. And until 2014, it worked to perfection. His first decade of rule was great. Turkey was getting about 5% GDP every single year. Foreign direct investments into Turkey were out of this world. The infrastructure investments by the government were massive. Real estate market was doing great. But keeping money cheap and keeping money plentiful devalued the currency. Because if you're not the United States, you don't produce the world's money, which means you're the money consumer. And if you buy so much of it, eventually it's going to take its toll. But why does it even matter? Why is it bad? Why having a devalued currency is so bad? Well, first of all, Turkey is an importer country. They're not an exporter like China. China was a net exporter. They intentionally devalued their currency to become the world's factory. Turkey is a net importer. Now their imports become expensive, which makes inflation even worse. Think of it as a double whammy. Inflation is causing currency devaluation, which is now raising the cost of goods to manufacture things, which raises inflation even more. In fact, companies that borrowed in US dollars or in euros, Turkish companies that is, now have to pay more in order to service their debt. Investor confidence in Turkey is going down the drain. FDI, foreign direct investments, are going down. And if you had savings in the Turkish lira, not in the US dollar, you're absolutely destroyed. It's savings carnage. So for an import nation like Turkey, it's not a good idea to devalue your currency. And obviously this was not 100% self-inflicted. Oil prices went up, and for Turkey, which is the massive importer of energy, that actually made things more expensive. We had high US interest rates, which drove investments away from Turkey. But the main issue was and is and remains the low interest rates for months and years and massive money supply for cheap, and the refusal of the Turkish government to raise rates. Now, Erdogan has his reasons of why he refused to do so. Some of it is political bribery or election economy, whatever you want to call it. For example, giving 700,000 public officials a 45% raise on the eve of the elections in May 2023. That actually did happen, while some of it was actually self-admittedly more theological. So that pushed Turkey to the brink of economic collapse. Erdogan tried solving the problems without raising rates by buying the Turkish lira with the foreign reserve currencies of Turkey and with help from the Saudis and Russia, which made things worse. When you spend your foreign reserves and you borrow in dollars to buy the devalued Turkish lira, surprise, surprise, you get absolutely slammed. Now, Russia has its own problems right now. The Saudis are tired of being the world's sucker, and the money supply for Turkey absolutely dried up. And the sad part about this is that the Turkish inflation problems did not start yesterday. They were always kind of there. Turkey always had a high inflation problem. But from 2021, they basically decided to solve the inflation problem by reducing rates. It's like putting out a fire by pouring gasoline on the fire, pretty much. So what happened? They've lowered rates, and inflation jumped from 17% to 70% in just 3 years. Now, they hired a new Fed chair, a new central bank chair from Goldman Sachs or whatever, I don't know. That lady decided to raise rates within a year from 8% to 50% because she saw that the country was on fire. That did not help. Inflation did not budge at all. In fact, right now, Turkey is at 70% inflation. It's almost an unthinkable number. Now, why is it going on? Well, the short answer is that Turkey is a net importer of goods, mainly energy. And when you're net importing goods and your own currency has plummeted 500% over the past 5 years, every time you bring in goods, it becomes more and more expensive. Now, also, there's no demand for the Turkish lira because essentially it's worthless and it's losing value every single day. But that lack of demand keeps driving it downwards, almost in this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy snowball effect. Now, it also doesn't help that Erdogan spent his entire foreign reserves to prop up the Turkish lira, and now he's out of money. And essentially, we have the situation where people can't afford anything. We have a huge economic crisis, and pensions have gone. And now the Turkish lira is basically irrelevant because it's proven to be worthless, so it's all dollarized or euroized, whatever you want to say, but the Turkish economy is basically working on this off-the-books dollar-euro system. So when you have this non-lira working market, effectively, when you raise rates from 8% to 50%, that doesn't do nothing because nobody ain't losing the lira. Simple as that. And to cap it off, it's very simple, guys. Look, when you have a bad policy that goes on for years and years and years for short-term gains, and you're selling off your entire future by essentially selling your soul to the devil, he really left no margin of error because he was flying way close to the sun, and then they had the earthquake, COVID, and all these stuff that happened that pushed Turkey into the situation where it cannot get out of. It's a net importer with a crushed currency. It's the opposite of what you want to have. Now, if Turkey was a net exporter, this conversation would not have been happening. But at the end of the day, this is an impossible situation for Turkey. And that's why embargoing exports, even to the Israelis, is not a good idea.
We're standing here at the Southern Steps, the place where we're introduced to the character of Paul the Apostle, one of the most fascinating and impactful characters of history. He starts out as a persecutor of the early church, who through a dramatic transformation and encounter with God, becomes the engine spreading the gospel from here in Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. But not only that, Paul does something incredible. He writes to those early churches, and still to this day, millions of people around the world can draw on his wisdom, his initial encounter, and passion for building the church to understand how God operates in this world. Today, we're going deep into the story of Paul the Apostle, the man who almost more than anyone else in history shaped the world we live in.
Who could have penned the words of 1 Corinthians 13? As a religious zealot? No, it's Paul. Pens these words on love that basically define love for the next 2,000 years. What would possess a man to do the things that he did, to try the things that he tried, to endure the things that he endured?
Anyone else who said, well, you come to the town, you have a message, well, we beat you half to death. We're not expecting you to come back.
Right.
And 2 years later, the same guy knocks on the door. It's like, excuse me, I'm not done with my message. And like, who is this guy?
He acknowledges it was the power of God's grace that allowed him to go on.
I met with Michael Cohen, who lectures on Paul the Apostle. His work with Derech Avraham, or Abraham's Path, has taken him throughout the Middle East, literally following in the footsteps of Paul. We met at the Caesarea port. Built around 10 BC by Herod the Great, this major port city played a pivotal role in the spread of early Christianity, especially for Paul. So Mike, we're here talking about Paul the Apostle, Shaul Deman, as we say in Hebrew. For someone who's never heard this name before, who are we talking about?
Shaul obviously was a child of the diaspora in a way. I mean, his family was from Tarsus, which was a very prominent city in the Roman Empire. It still exists today, actually, in southeastern Turkey, and then comes to Jerusalem at quite an early age, probably about 13. But he came here to, learn under the rabbis. He was respected in the council in Jerusalem. He's zealous, he's ambitious. Paul says, I was advancing beyond many my own age.
From the heart of Jerusalem's Jewish scholarly halls, an unexpected path waited for Paul. What came next? A radical transformation. So how does Shaul Saul transition to be the father of what we would call Christianity?
Yeah, it's funny you should say that because at times, we'll talk to Jewish people here in the land and they'll say to you, I don't have a problem with Yeshua, but I have a problem with Paul. Because he started the religion, in a way, that's their thought. So when he leaves, he gets letters. It's obviously this zealous young rabbi. He's going, forget it, I'm not even staying in Jerusalem, I'm going to Damascus. I've got authority from the chief rabbi, letters from the chief rabbi to do important missions around the Middle East. So he goes on his way to Damascus, which is only, about 40 kilometers to Damascus. He's hit by a light. So he's pushed off his horse, the light comes from heaven, and he is struck to the ground. He's basically saying, who are you, Lord? Who is this? And he says, I'm Jesus, who you're persecuting. And it's interesting because he's not really persecuting Jesus, he's persecuting the body, but Jesus has taken the body as personal, and he says, basically, you're persecuting me. He speaks about, in Galatians 1, the whole issue of, I received this gospel by revelation. I didn't really choose him, he chose me. On one side, it's kind of like, okay, I've been chosen by him, I'm in love with him, I understand who he is, but I'm also now being sent on a mission on this, this journey.
After his revelation, Paul set out on a clear mission to spread the word of Christ. Starting in Jerusalem, he journeyed to places like Antioch, Ephesus, Corinth, Philippi, and Thessalonica. However, his deep faith disturbed both Jewish and Roman leaders, who perceived his teachings as a threat to traditional beliefs and the empire's stability. Paul endured beatings, was stoned, and was imprisoned multiple times for his convictions. After facing trials in Caesarea, he embarked on his final journey to the heart of the empire, Rome.
That's right around 60 AD, and that's probably when he's going to be executed by Nero as a, most likely, if the Jews were a scapegoat, the Jewish sect of the Jesus the Nazarene was even more of a scapegoat. And most likely he's then executed in Rome. He lives to about 60 years, about 30 years after the crucifixion of Yeshua. They're probably somewhat the same age.
You highlight something that many people miss in the story of Paul. Because when you read the Bible from cover to cover, you oftentimes don't have an exact context of how long things take.
Right.
Paul has this very extended ministry time. I mean, he obsessively moves from place to place.
No, and incredible danger. I mean, he's talking about multiple shipwrecks, night and day on the open sea. And he's going through famine, he says. He's gone without clothes at times. I mean, the things that he goes through physically in his own body in this whole region, it's absolutely indescribable. But this whole idea is it's got to work in the most difficult, dark situation in the entire earth is part of what's driving me. The truth is the truth everywhere. And I'll pursue it no matter where it leads me. And that integrity, he does it from the innermost place to the outermost place of the earth. And that's what catches our attention. This is a Jewish story in a way. When he writes this book of Romans, he does say things that people, I don't think, even really understand or take notice of. I mean, he says in the Torah, we have the embodiment of knowledge and truth. I mean, wait a minute here. He's being accused of destroying the Torah. He's being accused of desecrating the holy places. He's got all these accusations, and yet his honor and his view of the scriptures remains very, very high. He upholds the Torah. He acknowledges that it's truth, but it's limited in its ability to save. And he says it right here to King Agrippa. He says to these things have no value in restraining the flesh, in getting over our tendency to sin. It's only the Holy Spirit, it's only this new covenant written on their hearts that will give us the power to overcome.
Yeah. I mean, to your point of why Paul was chosen,
right?
At the time, he probably looked at it, and the people around him looked at it as like, this is an odd choice.
No question.
But if you look at it today,
right.
So what are the character traits? What is a knowledge base? What are the oratory skills that are needed for someone to be able to traverse the world at that pace for that long?
One of the things about Paul that you have to say, especially in his early life, is that he was committed to following the truth wherever it led.
Yeah.
It's the obedience that comes from faith that is going to be the mark of the new covenant community.
Welcome back. When we think about Paul, about Shaul, we're sitting here on this beautiful balcony, but just behind us is the southern steps to the temple. And we know, according to the Mishnah, that Gamliel had his school where Paul was studying, was on those stairs. There's no doubt that Shaul Deman is a unique individual.
And if you think about this question of what does it take for the gospel that was a localized Galilee then Jerusalem event to go global, it really takes something very unique. I mean, there isn't any other incident in history where something that starts so small, or someone, especially someone like Paul, is able to take that message and spread it across the world. God picks people like Paul, someone who's both an Orthodox Jew of the time, both scholarly in Jewish studies, but also this incredible philosopher who's able to come and engage with different societies, different people. He's writing as a Jewish person, traveling the Roman Empire to communities of mixed Jews and Gentiles, trying to explain to them how they can believe in a Jewish Messiah.
In a Jewish Messiah, in a Jewish religion. And the fact is that when there was a wave of Gentile embracing this faith, here in Jerusalem, there was a debate among the disciples. What do we do with those Gentiles who are starting to believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and embracing Yeshua as their Messiah?
Yeah, and I think that's God's nature. He works in counterintuitive ways. He finds people like Shaul, Paul, who in a very creative and headstrong way brings this message to countries around the world where still today you can find believers in those same communities where he set foot.
Mm-hmm. Let's continue watching how a man that God meets impact the whole world till today. Let's continue watching.
So we've been sitting here talking about the life of Paul. Your life story, in a very interesting way, sort of connects to that through working with the churches in this part of the world. You've had the privilege that not many people in the world have of going back several thousand years later to the same places in eastern Turkey, throughout that region, where Paul, physically treks on foot and establishes what is the early church.
As a secular Jew coming to faith, I had kind of an unusual testimony. I actually got my call, sort of the Pauline kind of call, while I was in university studying, one of the best secular universities in the United States. And I think my professors thought, it's a lost cause, what do you know? They're the bad guys, and you're going to be off to be a missionary in who knows where. I came to this part of the world, I was learning Turkish and using it really as a base to go into the Muslim world. And a lot of that Muslim world had to do with Turkish and Kurdish speakers in an area where Paul traveled. So I started to travel the same journey and Paul was here, he was there. Oh, wait a minute, there was a Jewish community here, there was Jews here. Wait a minute, how did these come together? And you sort of got to walk it out in the context of mainly in a Muslim society where you had a lot of opposition to your faith.
Yeah.
So the issue of opposition and persecution and overcoming, those things were key in the message of Paul's life, what he embodied and everything else. And I started to really get into the letters of Paul. I'm serving the Lord in a part of the world that is extremely against the gospel. I would end up in villages somewhere in the Muslim world, and they'd maybe just returned from the Hajj. They were ready to stone you when they found out you were from Israel. So as I started to, understand more of his life, his roots, seeing the places, going to the cities, I not only started to understand more about what made up the man, just through the physical topography of how he had to travel, but I also started to see something else. He embodied this call of the Jewish people. And that's what caught my attention. The restoration of the Jewish people is a key part of even the New Covenant story. Even in the Jeremiah 31, I'm going to write the Torah on their hearts, but I'm also going to restore this historic divide between Israel and Judah.
Above all, what's frequently overlooked is that Paul's greatest aspiration was a united world, bringing Jews and Gentiles together in harmony.
He was a man of deep love, did whatever he could to bring people together. The best place we can see it is when he kind of writes Romans. I wish myself accursed, cut off, if only the sake of my Jewish people could come in. He says, willing to give up his place, his relationship with God, if only his Jewish people. Theirs is the adoption, theirs is the scriptures, theirs is the promises, theirs is the fathers. He still is honoring God's choice of Jerusalem and his own people, even though they're his biggest antagonist. That's incredible. Here he suffered so much at their hands, and yet he retained this heart of forgiveness, this humility, this love, this integrity. Literally the heart of Yeshua, even in the midst of all he went through. And that puts him in a class by himself.
Shaul, Paulus. Today with us we have Ron Cantor. Ron Cantor is one of the leaders of the Messianic movement here in Israel. He's an author of 2 books. Ron, what a great joy having you with us. A warm shalom.
Great
and
to
welcome.
be here. Thanks so much.
Ron, we talk about Paul, we talk about Shaul HaShaliach. When you think about Paul, what comes up in your mind?
A lot of Jewish people, when they talk about Paul, they say he was anti-Semitic. They say that he created a new religion. He left Judaism. But we don't find that in the New Testament. In fact, in Acts, he says, I am, present tense, a Pharisee. In Romans 11, he says, I am, not I was, an Israelite. He reveals his heart for the Jewish people in Romans chapter 9. Romans chapter 9, it's probably one of the most devastating passages in the entire Bible. And it shows God's heart for Israel through this Jewish rabbi Paul. Because what does he say? He says, I am telling the truth. I'm not lying. Now, first of all, isn't it a little weird that Paul, the apostle, has to say, I'm not lying? Well, Paul, we didn't think you would lie. In other words, he's about to say something so powerful that we might not believe it. And he says, I could wish myself accursed and cut off from Messiah for the sake of my own people, the people of Israel. He was willing to die for Israel.
When you think about the writings of Paul, what impacts you the most?
It's the background to the book of Romans. A lot of people don't know why he wrote Romans. Yes, salvation by faith, justification by faith. You know, Martin Luther had this great revelation from Rome. Absolutely, that's in there. But that's not why he wrote it. The reason he wrote it was because in 49, the year 49, Claudius kicked all the Jews out of Rome. And according to Suetonius, a historian, it was over somebody by the name of Chrestus, which nobody knows who that is, but it sounds a lot like Christos or Christ or Messiah. The scholarly hypothesis is that the Messianic Jews and the non-Messianic Jews were fighting, and Claudius he kicks the Jews out, and 5 years later, a guy by the name of Nero becomes the emperor of Rome. He lets the Jews come back in. And if you read the book of Romans, the Jewish believers rather, who came back into the Kehillah, into the church, they were not received. During the 5 years that they were gone, it seems that the believers there, now completely Gentile and without a Bible, because the Jews took there was no New Testament. There was no Romans because Paul is about to write Romans. Paul writes Romans and he says, has God rejected Israel? By no means. I myself am an Israelite. He says salvation has come to the nations because of Israel's rejection, but now you're called to make Israel jealous. So Romans was written because the Roman church became the first group of believers to become anti-Semitic, to turn against Israel. If we look at the end of the book of Acts, he calls for the Jewish leaders in Rome, and he wants to win them, and he says these change, because now he's kind of a home on house arrest. You know, they didn't have, what do they call the collars for his foot, but he was in chains, and he says, it's for the hope of Israel, Yeshua the Messiah, that I'm in this change. So to the very end, even though he was the apostle to the nations, he had such a heart to win Jewish people. So, you know, I just hope that our viewers understand Paul's heart, because Paul's heart was God's heart for Israel.
Beautiful.
And the great end times revival, it's going to start here in Jerusalem.
Amen. Ron, as you know, people are watching us from all over the world, people who love Israel, who loves the Jewish people. Just like a closing thought, and maybe if you have a message that you want to pass to the world.
Right. Well, you know, Paul said it's for the hope of Israel that he's in chains. And then in Romans 11, he says that Israel's rejection. Do you understand that God has imposed hardness of heart on our people for 2,000 years? So only a few of us actually have come to faith. Shmulik, myself, a few, 10, 20,000 here in Israel out of over 6 million. There's a hardness of heart that God, and I think it's broken God's heart, but that has enabled the nations to come into the kingdom. And he says that Israel's rejection caused riches for you in America or Russia or Italy or wherever you are. Israel's rejection caused riches for you. Paul says greater riches are going to come when the Jewish people accept the gospel. I just want to ask you, enter into Paul's heart. Go back and read Romans 9, where he says, I would be willing to perish, to go to hell, if only the Jewish people would believe. Read that and then to go into intercession for the Jewish people. Pray for revival here in Israel. Thank you.
Thank you. Ron, what a great honor. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.
And to you, our friends, like Ron told us, pray. Be a watchman on the wall. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Pray for the salvation of the Jewish people.
I'm on my way to the heart of Jerusalem, a city spanning just 48 square miles, though within its walls, over 500,000 Jews and nearly 1/3 Arabs live side by side. It's a city where everyday interactions mirror deep-rooted histories, and where tension often simmers just beneath the surface.
That place is beautiful, David.
Oh, thank you.
I'm meeting David Peli, the director and pastor of Christ Church, a church and congregation that defies the tensions of this city and embodies Paul's vision of unity in a divided world.
This is the oldest Protestant church in the Middle East, and it's been here in one form or another for 200 years.
What is Christ Church in Jaffa Gate? Like, how would you define this place?
Well, if I could use one word, I would say it's unique. It's a church that was built largely, although not exclusively, for Jewish believers in Jesus. We have an extensive work among the poor of Jerusalem. We can love Jews and love Arabs, we don't have to take sides, because certainly Jerusalem, a very divided city with a lot of misunderstanding, needs something like this.
Just like in the divided city of Jerusalem today, Paul envisioned creating unity, which he called one new man.
The heart of what Paul is saying is really very simple. At one time, Gentiles were quite hostile. You were lost. You were cut off from the God of Israel. You had no hope in the world. And yet, thanks to the life, death, and resurrection of the Jewish Messiah, now the Gentiles can come in and share in Israel's riches, and yet do not need to convert. The animosity between these two groups is put to an end thanks to the cross. And then Paul goes on to talk about this being one new man, right? One new creation. The imagery comes out of marriage, but what happens when two become one flesh? They still remain two. And you have unity, and yet you have diversity. And it is hard work. How am I going to live and serve and love others who may have some really difficult doctrines for me? The author of Acts tells us, and they were united. That understanding doesn't just come from the New Testament, it comes from the Old Testament.
Well, I love the Hebrew version of that. It says, they were one heart, one spirit. I think that's a very powerful phrase to aspire to. You're in this high friction, high conflict area. Well, how do you apply this, highbrow theology and philosophy and moral code into everyday life in the Old City in Jerusalem?
Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ. If there are people on the ground in a congregation and they're living in the midst of tension, like the tension in Jerusalem, and they're going out of their way to serve other Christians, especially those Christians they may not agree with, and that is what serves as a model for the rest of the community.
David and Christ Church inspire us all, and no doubt bring pride and honor to the memory, teachings, and vision of Paul.
We can be distinct, but at the same time live in what is best described as biblical unity. Everyone doesn't have to be like us. And that's whether you're in politics or on social media or in a church. Yes, the human anxiety is, I don't want people to be different. I want them really to be like me, or at least to think like me. That's not biblical unity. What we find in the book of Ephesians is the unity of the Spirit. And that unity of the Spirit is maintained by the way the members of any community treat each other. I hope that what happens here might inspire other people around the world.